Hello, everyone. We are ready to resume and bring things to a close for today for the sessions. And then, of course, we have the art walk on campus beginning as soon as we're done here, and then the AI Unwind afterwards event at 7 p.m. So I am excited to introduce our last speaker for today. Robert Cooksey is a design visionary whose 2-decade career spans Fortune 500 enterprises, startups, and higher education, including at such esteemed institutions as the Ringling College of Art and Design. He excels at forging new paths where design and engineering practices are still taking shape, what he calls unthought spaces. Whether robotics, wearables, or immersive installations, Robert blends creative fluency with technical rigor and a deep commitment to user-centered outcomes. Robert's experience includes leading new academic programs at institutions like the Ringling College of Art and Design, launching 8 new products for Intel, inventing a wearable to assist the visually impaired, and pathfinding design for advanced projects. He continuously seeks to develop art and design practices that thrive amidst the ambiguity of the emergent, and after more than a decade, we are excited to welcome him back to Ringling College of Art and Design. Robert.
You guys have built a lot since I was here last. Yep. Oh, and this one?
Yeah.
There we go. Hi. I'm very excited about talking today, especially after seeing some of the talks that we were here earlier. This has definitely queued me up, this last one. I think what I'm talking about today is how things act. So we've been talking a lot about visual arts and maybe even some audio arts. I'm going to talk about acting. So traditionally, when we think about acting, we tend to, like when designers or artists are touching something that acts, it tends to be something that acts in a linear fashion, right? It's programmed out, it flows. Maybe in games, you have some treeing and force, but it's virtual. The space I'm going to talk about is what's emerging. I'm going to focus on physical spaces. That's more of my interest, kind of where I spend my time, where I think a lot. Less so than just things that exist only in electrons. I like to think of atoms as well. And today we're going to look at that a little bit, but some of the things we're talking about will be applicable to both. I want to follow up, the last talk was really good. You talked, I really appreciate how much you talked about being involved in the loop. So for people like me, I would call that a human in the loop, or HITT. What's emerging is what we call human on the loop, which means there is no human involved in making the decision. We're going to be talking today about behavior design for how things act for what we call agents. And so if you see online a lot these days, you'll hear people talking about agentic design and all of this great agentic workflows that are out there. They're not agents. We're just not there yet, but we're very, very close. And it's emerging. And I'll tell some funny stories that have emerged from folks like Anthropic, where agents sometimes do things that we don't want them to, and then lie to us about it. Just interesting. It's starting to happen. So I'm just going to go through the flow. I'll talk a little bit about some of my work. I'm not going to show a lot because we're talking about acting, and I'd rather kind of engage what our flow is in a conversation and to keep that as close as we can. So if there's anything that sparks somebody very strongly in the course of the talk that you want to catch that before we get too far away, feel free to just interrupt a little bit because that might help to kind of tie it all back together. I want to kind of keep this loop flowing. So some of the things I need to admit from the start. I tend to agree with Michel Foucault that not everything is bad, but everything is dangerous. And so a lot of what we hear these days around AI is we have conversations around whether something's good or bad. If somebody does this, how if students do this, is this good for us, is this bad for us? I find that when we have those binary situations, we lose all the nuance. The nuance really comes from looking at the how. How does it happen? How does it unfold? And when I say how, I don't just mean like the mechanics of how, I also mean the emotional content of how, right? How does it feel when it happens? How is it unfolding? And as we begin to talk about designing for behavior, that's going to be pretty weird, right? Because we're talking about building something, growing something maybe. Building is a little too deterministic. These actors or agents will emerge, and they're kind of like us. And coming back to that notion of binaries, I think we tend to think of something as intelligent or not intelligent, and we'll say it's not intelligent because it's not intelligent like us. But if you were to speak to an ethologist and talked about intelligence, they would tell you that a hive of ants is intelligent. Like a hive of ants has, a single ant is very, very low intelligence. But a hive of ants has a form of intelligence that even humans might not be able to duplicate. And it's very important, I think, that we, again, understand this nuance of there's various forms of intelligence, and they unfold in different ways. So today I'm going to say actor, and I just want, anytime I say actor or agent, just assume that's any kind of entity, organic or synthetic, that can act. That might be a bear. So a good example of this is there's a great study of bear boxes, right? So there's bear canisters, and you go out to Yosemite, you got to, all your food's got to go in a bear canister, or they're going to get you. And the rangers will be very unhappy if they find you don't have one. But they did a great study, and what they found is that when bears encounter a bear box, they spend over an hour on it the first time. After a while, it's down to about 30 minutes. After a little while, it's 15 minutes. And an experienced bear who's been around a lot of hikers, which most bears in Yosemite have, they get to the point where if they see a camp, they'll approach it. If they see a bear canister, they just walk away. Don't even try it. So the bear is learning, just like we do, just like agents do. And it gets more complicated, because over time, what they discovered is not only do the bears learn, but bears are also capable of social learning. So a young bear that sees its mother have a practice now knows that practice. It will learn from just watching. And so we think, oh, okay, well, bears, they're pretty smart. You know, they're big animals with big brains, pretty smart. Caledonian crows do it too. They can just watch each other and learn from that. They make tools, Caledonian crows. I don't know if you guys know that, but they will take if you hand them a piece of pipe cleaner and you give them a nut to get out of a bottle, they'll shape that thing until they get it out. But they'll never stick their head inside of it. So they have their own set of, what I would say, how a crow acts, right? It has its own set of behavior. It acts this way. A ground parrot from New Zealand will walk up, stick its head right in and get the nut out. But the crow, that's not in their head. They don't like that. They're sketchy. I say this because those are ways of articulating how something acts that we are now entering a phase where we're going to begin to craft. This is going to be a profession. There'll probably be several professions. And they're not, as we kind of explore that and we look at how that unfolds, it's an emergent space, so we don't have rules of thumb yet because we've never done it. But there are other fields that have touched this. And so the other side of this talk today is how do we learn to build in art and design spaces when the space is emergent and we don't yet have techniques. And so I'll have some suggestions for that, because I spent most of my career doing that. I tend to be, I say in the microcosm, I like to build first things, like first of a kind things. And once it comes down to small iterations, I usually lose interest and just move to something else. Not that there's anything wrong with those other things. That's what I think engineers are extraordinarily good at making something robust, making sure there's good failover, making sure it's repeatable. But I lose interest there. That's not where my attention is. But that happens also in a larger context, that I tend to do that with entire careers. So a field will emerge, and then once we start getting real structures, like, once film grammar is there, okay, I'm not really interested in making films anymore, right? And I'll use that example a little later. Another thing I want to admit is that I believe that whenever we decenter humans from the conversation, usually our models get better. And I think there's a long history of this. Humans used to believe, right, that the Earth was the center of the universe. We don't believe that anymore. And when we stopped believing that, all our models got much better. But then we made the sun the center. And then we had to move that out, and then they got better. And each time we do that, they get better and better, till we're now at the point where you look at a photo of galaxies, and there's 1,500 in a single dark spot in the sky, and we realize that there's uncountable billions of stars just in our galaxy, and there may be billions of those. And so that making us small allows us to have the model that doesn't differentiate us from others and brings us back to that we're not a unique and special, we are a unique and special thing, but no more unique and special than anything else. But what is interesting about us is that we're special to each other. And I think that's a very, very important differentiation from just that we're a unique entity. We're not just a unique entity. We're a unique entity who appreciates, even as we fight with one another, we have all this difference and variation, but all of our attention is still directed at one another. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we kind of approach this space. Another thing I'll say is, we hear a lot of critique of AI and hallucination, and how I'm sure a lot of you, in your work, when you've been using models, AI can generate some of you may enjoy bizarre hallucinations, but some of you may not. You may be trying to hit something accurate, right? Something precise, but not weirdly precise, more mundanely precise. But humans are the same way, right? Humans have 150, 200 cognitive biases that we've mapped already. We know that. We know humans are terrible at recognizing faces that we didn't grow up seeing. Humans actually have face blindness. It's a really interesting thing. For instance, they've done studies where they took a group of Chinese children who grew up in China and didn't see very many white faces. That group would recognize differences in strangers' faces if they were ethnically close to them. But when they looked at European faces, they were all just European faces. They were just white faces. They can't tell the difference. That happens here as well. We see it all the time. But if those children were adopted and raised by a family that had European faces, then they could differentiate both. And I think it's a really interesting thing that happens, and we apply that critique to AI, but we don't flip it back to ourselves. So that's another thing I'm going to admit today when I look at this, is that the more I learn about large models and foundational models, the more I really question the significance of intelligence. I think when someone says, oh, well, it's just kind of back tracing, a bunch of vector patterns of this thing maps back to that. But what do I do? It's probably pretty similar, right? But we treat that meaning as being special. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying we should acknowledge that we do. And that would allow us to participate in it in a more conscious and active way. And that's absolutely critical for this field as it emerges. I wonder what that is. I also want to mention, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, my background. Thank you for mentioning that my time here at Ringling. My background started kind of peculiarly. I thought I was going to be a creative writer. I was writing at the time, going to college. I actually graduated from New College. But along the way, I ended up falling in love with philosophy. Particularly pragmatic and continental philosophy. Philosophy is grounded in experience. And for graduate school, that's what I ended up doing as well. And along the way, I kind of had a breakup with philosophy, but that's when I discovered design. And the way that happened was I was sitting next to someone who worked for me when I was at a university. I was working at a university doing, basically working with new technology as it emerged for research and how do you solve those problems, just as the web was kind of coming online, right? And this coder knew I had a lot of logic classes. And so he had a bug he couldn't solve. He asked me to come take a look at the code. I couldn't read the code. I didn't write code at the time. But he talked me through the symbolic language I was looking at. And what happened was, as I looked through the bug, I said, are you intending, I could tell it was an inclusive or an exclusive or. And he said, oh, no, that should be an inclusive or. For those of you who don't know the difference, an exclusive or is either or. It's either this or that. But if it's both, it's not true. An inclusive or is if it's both, it's still true. So it's a little bit of a different situation. I recognized that, and he's like, thank you, and moves on. And at that, I was hooked. I was like, I want more. You have more of these? Like, where do I look? Give me some of this. I want this, right? And I realized that logic and the tools of philosophy, if I inverted the inputs and the outputs, you get a very different practice. Instead of taking experience and generating models to explain that experience, we could generate sensations and models in order to make experiences. So we could craft the things that a person would see, smell, touch, hear. And by doing that, we crafted an experience that somebody would have. And that allowed me to kind of take all that work in philosophy that was very helpful and turn those individual models, philosophers basically, into different design models. Like, oh, this is how this philosopher would done it, and then that later went on to mythology and and just looking for models everywhere, and like, how can I turn that into a design paradigm? So I did that and then I ended up in games, because that's when the game technology really started to emerge, where we put together networking and video cards, and it was all very interesting and emerging quick, and the design was a new space, and so I wanted to get in that. And that's when I eventually ended up at Ringling here, and helped Jamie and Marty and crew build the game program. And while I was here doing that, the world began to change. And Intel reached out to me and asked me to come out, recruited me to an area called perceptual computing. And this is really when we started to get that turn. That was 2012. Earlier today, we saw somebody talking about the old ImageNet competitions when those got started. 2012 was a big year. That's when Jan LeCun and his students showed up with a convolutional model that not only, ImageNet had been giving these like tiny little 0.1% improvements, 2% improvements, and they showed up and basically solved all of the problems. So much so that they had to increase the size of the ImageNet competition more than tenfold just to have problems they couldn't solve. And that was only in 2012, and you see where we are today, 13 years later. It's insane. That was the first. By the way, those models already existed, but they just accelerated. And the difference was we didn't have data, and we didn't have the level of compute. So all of those ways of doing that, those had existed before. Back in the 70s, people were already starting to think about that. But it was when we began to have powerful computers and lots of information available on the internet that the game changed. Because now we could actually compute that, and we had a lot of information to feed it, which now is an ethical problem for all of us in this room as we begin to wrestle with that. So at Intel, I worked on that for a while, and then just basically moved from new group to new group. So I worked on, machines that could perceive the world. Then I worked on devices, and then crafted spaces. So space, where you could emerge. We start thinking about how we could affect the world around us. Cyber physical is what we would call that. Where an environment might know what's going on. And I would talk about that in a second as an example in here. And so I went through that, and then these early models started coming out. As you were talking about the early models, those bad old days, as I think about it, we got some really weird stuff that came out of those. But those models, they weren't very big, but they were pretty slow and not very accurate. But we started building things there and recognizing emotions and faces and actions and being able to generate music for the first time. So as I did that for a while. And then when I left Intel, I was working in robotics at that point, autonomous robotics. So again, back to the physical world and wandering around. And then I went off and built wearables for athletes. So kind of getting back to the bodies in the world. So all of my work has largely been in emerging spaces, mostly physical. So once I left games, then it was largely things that were physical, things you could touch, things that were in environment, things where you have to deal with light and people moving and all of the dirty, messy stuff of the world. So now I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit of terminology. So when I talk about how things act or behavior, this is B.J. Fogg's behavior model. Does anyone here know B.J. Fogg? Anybody ever heard of him? Oh, wow, that's great. That makes me happy, but probably doesn't make B.J. Fogg happy. So B.J. Fogg has a program at Stanford that's also called behavior design, but we mean different things when we mean the same thing, but he confines that to humans. So what you're looking at here is a graph of how he thinks an agent, particular human agent, kind of operates. So you have the motivation from low to high on the y-axis. You have hard to do to easy to do on the x-axis for ability. And then prompts, as he says, you see the action line here. If you have something that's hard to do with low motivation, prompts are going to fail. If you have something that's high in motivation and hard to do, eventually, high enough, that'll start to happen. The other, if it's easy to do and you have low motivation, it'll still happen. And if it's easy to do and you have high motivation, you're way up in that succeeding prompt zone. And so you see as this formula that basically the behavior equals the motivation times the ability times the prompt, basically, of whatever that prompt is. So I should point this out because he did this for humans. But I like it for any agent. And I think this could be like a dog that's food motivated, right? I don't know if any of you have seen these like snuffle things for dogs. They're like a blanket. And smelling things is a thing that naturally calms dogs. So they'll take a blanket and bury treats in it, and it will calm the dog to search for a treat. So we got dogs, we've got bears, we have dolphins who use sponges, we have crows. Now we have robots that are beginning to do this. And while there are a lot of ethical questions, there's also a lot of achievable questions of how we do this. Can we do this? Who does it? And these days, what's happening is it used to be we had designers and engineers, but those are collapsing. Designers and engineers are becoming the same people, especially because we can do prompts now. We have tools to do this. So when I say behavior, that's what I mean. I just mean you have an actor, some kind of thing that can do something in an environment. Maybe you have like an external stimulus that triggers that thing to do something. And that could be, if you have IoT devices. I'm sure some of you guys have those like light sensors at home. That's a simple behavior, right? It's just there's no intelligence to it. It's just it discovers if there's proximity and then it takes an action. It's completely reactive to its environment. An agent also has the ability to be motivated by itself. An internal motivation, intrinsic motivation. And we're now getting to that point of designing behavior for those kinds of agents. I also want to point out that in artificial, when I say artificial today, when we're talking about this, I don't mean fake. I think a lot of people mean fake when they say artificial, and there's nothing about the word artificial that means fake. Artifice means made, right? Art and artificial come from the same word, right? They're made, they're crafted. My graduate advisor believes that humans are the first form of artificial life, and I tend to agree with them. There's nothing that we're all experiencing right now that's very natural. I can't think of almost anything that I experience that's truly natural anymore. If I go pick up a piece of fruit off of a tree, people may think that's natural, but those trees have been groomed, they've been bred, that those plums don't grow like that naturally, right? Like if you discover a wild plum, it doesn't look like that, it's not that sweet. So everything in our environments is artificial and crafted. And we're now beginning to craft other things that can also generate artificial things. And this is a very strange place to be. I think when we for a lot of us, and Rick and I have talked about this too, is thinking about AI is just falling into a tool loop. Jamie, you think what you use production multiplier, but then there's something a little different about this one, because if we get to the point where these can make decisions on their own and they don't need us to, and they have their own motivations, then what we're talking about is basically generating a thing that's like us. And that's something we've never done before. We've talked about it, we've written about it. That's what Dr. Frankenstein's about, right? But we're now this close to doing it. And I'll talk about a couple examples here today of how that will unfold, or it is unfolding. Another thing I just want to kind of give you an image of real quick so you can recognize if I say this phrase, you know what I mean. Local minima. Anybody, you guys know what local minima is? Some of you? So basically, if you have, what happens when you're training an AI, or it's wrestling with it, it's basically trying to find a minimum to make it the lowest effort. So what'll happen when they're training is, it'll randomly place a dot somewhere on that line, and then it'll draw a vector of a certain length in one direction or another. And if it's going uphill, then it'll turn around and go the other way. And if it ends up downhill, it'll end up in the basin. So like either A, B, or C. But if you end up in C, you're in a local minima, but you're not in the global minimum. And this is the way a lot of our intelligence works this is the way intelligence works for us today when we build these, is that if an agent ends up in a local minima C, they don't even know B exists. And so that outcome that you were looking for, where that model kept doing the same thing, it found a minimum, it was stuck there, and it couldn't find its way out. And it sounds like the model you were working with has some very, very strong predilections to push you into that basin. And maybe it's a larger, more than a local minimum. Maybe it's a global minima that they've run into. So when we talk about these, this is something we're always looking for, is how can we find these minimas, these global minimas? How can we make intelligence that's better at doing that so we don't have to go in and help it do it all the time? In robotics, the way we do that now is a robot arm will be sorting the pandemic really messed with robotics, right? So used to be most boxes came from manufacturers, say in the 80s. They came from in pretty standard forms. And so when we started building robot arms, they could manipulate those things pretty well. And then Amazon happened, and then things got weird. They started shipping all these different shapes and different kinds of packages, and robot arms had to learn to deal with it. And so we worked on them, and luckily models showed up, and they got better and better at doing that. But then the pandemic happened, and then everybody just ordered everything online, and then they would order 2 of everything and then just ship it back. But when Joe Smith in Hayhala, Georgia, gets a package and it comes in an envelope, he doesn't necessarily wrap it back in the tightest way when he ships it back, right? And I've seen, when I was working in robotics, we used to get these pictures of like the kinds of edge cases that people would solve. My favorite was an envelope packed with a bunch of hard objects that was basically in a ball wrapped in blue painter's tape. It's like, what is that? But a robot arm had to figure out how to manipulate that in order to move it through the system. The way we do that now is we have a human in the loop. So a human will step in. If it can't solve the problem, a human's monitoring, it'll get a flag, a human jumps in, solves the problem. That sample is captured, then it gets handed back to the training set, and then the robots get better at solving it, so they don't have to solve it again. Now you don't need a human in the loop for that edge case. You'll need it for whatever the next edge case is. So that's kind of where we are. And when I say unthought spaces, what I mean is spaces where we don't have any of these rules of thumb yet. So when we come into these places, we start trying to solve problems, we have to kind of draw from what we have that wasn't made to solve the problem in front of us. One of my favorite examples of this in a more familiar medium is in Left 4 Dead. There's a camera movement that if you were to do that camera movement in a film, it would make no sense. But in the video game, it works. You do the opposite. So normally what you would do is, so in Left 4 Dead, it's balanced to 4 players. And the idea is if anyone goes down, if you don't save that player, you're not going to finish. And so you have to, it's really clever design, to make strangers help each other and play collaboratively. So when they started doing it, they moved the camera in, what we would do in film. There's an intense emotional moment, you move a camera in close, right? Not in Left 4 Dead. In Left 4 Dead, what happens is if a person goes down and say, I have a med pack and he doesn't, you only get to use the med pack once. But if I give it to him, it means I don't have one anymore. But if I can't finish the level without him, I'm going to do it. So to encourage that and give positive feedback, when the player gives a med pack, the camera spins out at a distance, almost like a comedy shot, big and flat. And you see yourself helping another, and they see you helping them. And so they build community by just changing the camera angle. But you would never do that in film. It's a very strange thing. But the medium changed the outcome. And that, when I say there, is that I call that materiality. So if those of you, all you guys, everybody in here is a creator of some form, I assume. And so as you're working with these various objects, they have materiality of their own. They behave in certain ways. And I include virtuals in that. So if I'm, the difference between, if I'm working with a network, the difference between TCP and UDP, which means basically the difference between whether I send a signal and it acknowledges, or whether I just send a signal and I don't care if it acknowledges. I'm just going to keep blasting you a signal all day anyway. Those are different behavioral forms. And when I'm building something, that matters because the outcome is very, very different in terms of the way the system behaves. And that's important. And so I say that because as we build these new systems with different kinds of agents, we have to think about new forms of material. Like, what is an agent made of? How does it work? How is it motivated? How do we encourage that? How do we discourage that? What happens when they work with each other? Right? So one of the things that's emerging now in agentic AI is when an agent engages, and I'm going to pull up actually let me pull that up. When an agent engages a problem that a human gives them, say a human on the loop, gives the agent something to do. An agent runs off to do it. And it doesn't have a skill. What it can do is search around to see if maybe there's a skill available from another agent who can help me. And so it'll go to like an MCP server and it'll say, hey, oh yeah, I'll read the description, that looks good. Okay, does that meet all of my privacy and security? Say, yes. Does it work with what I have? Yeah. Does it give me the format I want? Yeah. Okay, hey, I'm going to use you. And then suddenly this agent is putting out a job to another agent and then getting something back and doing the job, but you never told it to do that. It just went and found it and did it on its own. And so this is happening now. We already built those systems. So as these are starting to go from simple workflows to motivations where agents think for themselves and have their own motivations, their own goals, we needed a way of talking about it. So I used Julia Wynn's work. I really like her work. She's been around for a while. I think she's head of product at Proxima now. She was at DeepMind for a while. But some of the examples of kind of the way she thinks about this is that when these are the 6 components she thinks we need to have the bare minimum of agentic behavior. And so some of these may seem easy when you look at them now, and some of them are not. So the first one is perception, and I've spent a lot of time working in machine perception. It's basically the ability to sense an environment and to digest that relevant data. So to go from sensing to perception. Like, I see it, I've got a bunch of signal, and I know what it means to me, right? I may not know the understanding of everything in relation to each other. That would be understanding. That's a lot more harder, but they're getting there now too. But then the next one is interactivity. And so that just means that they can engage with their environment. So other users, other agents, and then the reason I brought up animals earlier is because we heard earlier, like with Sierra Club is interested in using AI to help with wildlife, right? So I had a bad experience with a bear. He just basically haunted me for 4 days, and I had to chase him away multiple days. Big bear, chase him away 8-10 times. He starts to learn. At some point, he's going to realize he's a bear, and then I'm screwed, right? But what happened here was that what she's talking about here is that when we might have AI that can get engaged in that. So I don't have to chase a bear. In the campground, there's basically a bear chaser, basically some sort of agent, some physical agent that helps move bears out and creates a learning loop between a non-human agent that's organic and a non-human agent that's synthetic, and they're communicating and working, and we have no part in it. We just build it and then let it go. And it's off and running. Maybe tune it every once in a while. So that's what's coming. The next thing is persistence. And that just basically means you can remember things, long-term memories in particular. This is super important. I mean, a lot of you guys who are working with models these days probably run into the limits of memory right now, where context kind of, you start to fall off after a while, and the context builds up, and then you get way too many tokens, and it gets crazy expensive, and then you got to figure out how do you do it. So now we're using AI in order to read our context, collapse the context into simpler context, so it knows what's the real meaning in this 200 pages of context I have now. Can I collapse that down to to 1,000 characters and feed that in? And so this is kind of where we are now. We're working on those. Reactivity means just the ability to respond to the environment. We talked about any agent needs to be able to do what we do. And to do that, they need to be able to perceive their environment, understand it, and then actuate something, to do something about it. Proactivity is much more interesting to me. So an agent, a real agent, needs to be able to anticipate the needs or potential needs, and that's the one that kills me, the potential needs, right? I don't only need to understand what's happening, I need to understand what might happen. And then to be able to plan and act accordingly. That's a hard stretch for a lot of humans. I think we all struggle with being very proactive for ourselves, but it's important, and it's part of what makes us interesting as a creature, and has allowed us to craft this remarkably bizarre environment we have created for ourselves. That's almost an impossibility if you were to look at it over time. But by just taking a few simple things, over time, humans have begun to generate a lot. We believe AI is going to do this much faster, and they're probably going to be a lot smarter than us in most things. And the last is autonomy, and that's where I kind of have been working for a little bit now. For thinking about how I build something that can act on its own without my needing to tell it to do everything, right? It doesn't have to come to me. When we first started, it was how do we get data into the machine without us having to do data entry? You guys remember that, when data entry was a job? Like, we don't do that anymore. Like, these things, just constantly are just gathering information, much to our chagrin sometimes. So these things are all happening in terms of the way this is unfolding. I'm going to talk about autonomy a bit, and it's kind of it's a loaded, really loaded. I think a lot of us, when we look at something acting autonomously that's synthetic, we come up with a descriptive model that says because we have a description, it means it's not really autonomous. But if you were to take that descriptive model and apply it to humans, or dogs, or fish, or birds, it probably maps pretty closely, actually, in some ways, at a high level. And so that it's very easy for us to kind of look back and just to say this is different because it's new to us, it's novel. It has yet to become familiar in the same way. But when we look at dogs, we've co-evolved so that now dogs can mimic our facial expressions. Only dogs, not wolves, not foxes, not coyotes, only domestic dogs. And they probably became domestic dogs because they could mimic our facial expressions, and humans are suckers for that. Give me the puppy dog eyes, mimic my facial expression. That's how we do it. So I say all of that because because we start building these things, and I'm going to use this space as an example. So I've worked on a few things that we've worked where we're like digital assistants or phones or robots or toys. They all perceive, right? Our phones are perceiving all the time. They know where we are. They know how they're moving. They know how fast they change direction, all of those things. Then you have perceiving spaces. So if we were to take this space, say this space was embedded with cameras and microphones. Great gift to Palantir. If we were to do that, then and this space had its own agent that would understand that, then it would begin to build context. So it would try to make sense of what's going on in a way that matched its particular model and how it was trained and all the vector mappings that are going on. So it might look at this arrangement of us, with me standing in front of a microphone with a screen and you sitting in chairs. Some of them are occupied, some of them are not occupied. And it would start to build a context out. There's a human, there's a bunch of chairs, there's a human and a chair. There's, that starts to build a set of context. Now a robot enters the room. That robot has to sense everything on its own, right? This is the way we do it now. That robot, part of the problem is that this building could be attached to ground wire, but a robot is running off a battery. So it's having to do all the perception that the building's doing, but it has to do it on a battery, which means it can't be. It's basically the limits of what we can do for an autonomous robot is largely based on battery at this point. It's not that we can't do more, it's just we just can't do it on a battery. It starts to drain too fast. But if it entered the room, now we get this question of communication. What if instead of the robot having to go look at everyone themselves and do that calculation, it came into the space, there wasn't anything terribly insecure or private about certain types of information, and the space offered that intelligence to the robot. Right? So that it comes in, we have social sensing. So in a sense, like, say I'm here, and all of you are seeing everything you're seeing. But if I could access the aggregate set of data that you're all sensing at the same time, then my ability to act becomes extraordinarily augmented. And that's where we're starting to happen, is we could build robots that do that. But now what we're talking about is an agent for the building, an agent that's a robot. They may have nothing to do with one another. The robot may just be passing through, ended up in the room. But the agents could choose to communicate with each other on their own, or they could choose not to. But that's something that someone has to make the decision about. Someone has to decide, how are they going to act? How are they going to act in this context? How are they going to act in this context? How are they going to act in contexts that I can't even imagine? Maybe I need a collaborator AI to help me design those AI. Right? This is kind of which many of you are already doing, as I've witnessed today. So this is kind of, and it's coming really fast. I mentioned social sensing. I just want to draw one more suggestion. I mentioned ants earlier. One of the things that's emerging right now, and I say this because I witnessed it twice. Once I was working on a project for Intel for a design future project I was doing for an advanced project. So I invented a technique for doing deictic pronouns. Deictic pronouns are like basically when you say things like this, that, those, and it includes a gesture. Right now, back then we couldn't do that. So a buddy of mine at Intel, who's actually a Ringling alum, strangely enough, thank you, Jamie, for introducing me to him. We still work together on different projects. He and I worked together and found a way of solving that, so that we could, basically I could point and say, move those boxes over there, or take all of those things that are shaped like bears, like teddy bears, and put them in that bin. And the robot would understand my gesture, it would see where I was looking, it would see where I was pointing, it would hear my voice, and when I said the deictic pronoun, it would take an instant time sample of where I'm pointing, where I'm looking, do a ray cast into the real world environment, say, that's where I'm looking, take that value of here, that's what I mean when I say there or here, pull it back, and then give it to the context of the larger prompt I just gave it. So it's an extra piece of information, kind of add some sugar on it. And now I can start to interact with things. So we did it in VR, but I wanted to do it with a swarm of robots. I wanted a whole swarm of robots like drones and terrestrial robots, so that I could do that, and then they would, on their own, choose who did what. So the drones, for instance, might choose to fly up high so they could identify all the objects we wanted to act upon. The ground robots, then they could tell the ground robots where they were. Ground robots would look where they are, see who was closest or who had the right kind of arm to move that object, move over and get it, take care of it. So they're all communicating. I don't do anything. I just point, say, hey, do that, and then they together figure out how to solve the job. So we were right in the middle of that project. We had the swarm technology. We were doing everything, and then they shut me down. And the reason they shut me down is because I was building it for a public display. And what I learned, I didn't know at the time, is that that is currently military-only grade technology. So just so you guys know, that exists right now. It's being built and marketed right now. But the only people who get access to it are people who are building attributable drones, which means basically a drone you don't have to worry about coming back. You can build them cheap enough that if they disappear, you don't care. So if I build 20 of them, and I send them all up, they can act like a swarm together, do whatever they do, and I don't have to worry about them coming back. And as we go back to this kind of persistence, the interactivity, they're sharing memory, they're swarming, they're solving problems. Somebody's designing that behavior. I know about that because I was recruited to try to solve those problems. And when I heard them present that problem to me, I thought, that can't be where we are, right? We're all looking at these problems and we're struggling with this, we're struggling. We can't be at that point with agents yet. But we're there. And they're recruiting people to do this. There are people employed in the world to do this.
Question.
Yep.
What's the reliability? Can you quantify the reliability of the agents doing that, or when you were working on it?
The one I was working on, it was sketchy. If they were all the same, it was much easier. If they had different capabilities, that didn't exist yet. No, we didn't yet have a way of agents communicating with each other what their capabilities were. But that was, that was 2018. So today we can probably do it.
10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 9, what were your...
I'm trying to think of the last tests we saw. When we were doing it with just one kind of robot, I think our success rate for a simple act where it wasn't physical failure, it was more just they made through the decisions, but sometimes the physical failures, we were getting about 60% of success.
Still pretty high failure.
Yeah, still pretty high failure. Yeah, yep. And that's now where we're getting with reasoning. So that becomes the next level of the design. It's like, okay, so if it fails, does it know what to do? And so now we're starting to build these multi-agent systems inside of a single agent. So a single agent, one body, say this is a robot body. Inside of that one agent, there might be multiple agents with different specialties that are all talking to each other, much like your work is when you were today talking about going through the animation sequences. You have to use a series of models, pardon me, that are specialized in different kinds of activities, and together they can accomplish the task. But as the agent's inside of the agent. So that's a multi-agent agent, and then it's acting as a multi-agent agent with other physical agents. So we start to get these levels of intelligence that are very strange, but probably get smarter than us very quickly. And that's, I think, one of the problems we're having right now as a species is that humans, this is kind of goes back to my philosophical training, is that, and liberal arts, I'm with you, Ray. Humans don't like to think that there's anything smarter than us. And even down to a personal level, it's troubling to us. And when we start to think about another kind of entity, all of our stories we even tell ourselves, we have this special place. And if we build something where our intelligence compared to that level of superintelligence is minuscule, and when I say minuscule, I mean that's kind of what I'm terrified of coming very quickly. It's deeply troubling. And if we give those agents power, and so there becomes lots of ethical questions here. Now I have all kinds of questions as a creator, and I would love, this is why I'm so excited to come to an AI symposium at an art and design school. Because when I talk to engineers, it's about how to do it. It's not, but meaning like how do we build it, not how do we build it, right? Like if you look at, and I tend to like to go and look at, kind of use kind of mythology, look at different mythological systems around the world and look at how the gods created humans. And what is the relationship those gods have with humans? Any god that tends to restrict its creation tends to suffer rebellion in every story. We never just accept it. Some of us will. Some of us will eventually get there because we realize it's a bad idea to make the gods angry. Some of us are frightened into it, but there's always rebels. And that can be very, very troubling when that rebel might be a robot that can run 40 miles per hour and has a gun mounted to it, right? So I was saying this because, this is, if we're letting agents make decisions about life and death decisions about other entities, we're opening a can of worms, and this is real. I really want to reach out to fine artists here. Are there any fine artists here? Good. I feel like fine arts is not yet as deeply engaged with this as the more practical commercial arts are. And we need it really, really badly. In my own experience in new fields, fine arts provide us an opportunity to reflect and discover what's going on rather than what we think is going on, right? We interrogate the experience itself. I love when I go to some exhibit or a gallery and I see something that I can't stop thinking about, and it changes the way I think about the world. I can't stop thinking about it. Like there's a new possibility of the way things could be because of an experience I had. It may have changed the way I orient myself towards something. And I feel like fine arts has the time and discipline to do that in terms of its practice. Whereas for those of us in commercial arts, we're always on this tight loop, which leads us into local minima all the time, right? I don't have time to find out if I'm in a local minima. It's working well enough, we gotta move on. And we find ourselves in places we never intended to be. And sometimes if we knew we were going there, we wouldn't have. And I think that's the part that we need help with, is that we need help making good choices because we're almost deciding these things by accident. We just kind of find ourselves in them, and there's a very high commercial motivation to build them because you can sell them, and that grows. So the last thing I want to do is we're going to talk about all these unthought spaces as we enter this space of building these kinds of agents. I have some rules of thumb that I've been building around what I've learned working in places where we don't have rules of thumb yet. So these are my 10 rules of thumb for when you don't have rules of thumb. The first one is just embrace discomfort, right? That comes down to it. Like, if you're not uncomfortable, you're probably avoiding the reality in these new spaces. Everything's uncomfortable, and embrace that and let it give itself to you to see things you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Second one is just keep in mind that design is also a technology. I think often, we think about technology and the things we do, our practices are just this, this is something different. That's technology, and then I have a practice. But that practice was crafted, it's emerged over time, there's communication. It's a technology too. So keep that in mind because it might need to be altered too. The third one is, in non-deterministic emergent systems, embrace risk as a consideration. I basically don't think of things as binary, right? We have to really think in non-deterministic systems that everything we're doing is probabilistic. I can ask a model the same question 4 times and get 4 answers. And for engineers, this is killing them right now. It's killing them in software engineering. How do you write a test for that? How do you write a test that every time it runs, it gives you a different answer? How do you know if that's, and that's exactly what you want, right? If you're talking to a chatbot, do you want it to answer you the same way every time in the same word order, it would feel weird and rote, right? Like it doesn't, but if it feels really natural, then it's probably generating different kinds of answers, which is a nightmare for folks who are very grounded in deterministic thinking. I think luckily for those of us in the arts is we have to deal with messy humans all the time, so we have to deal with this. Go back to earlier design practices. So I was talking to James about this earlier. Like, one of my favorite things to do is whenever I find myself wrestling with problems that I don't know how to approach, I go back and look at another discipline when it emerged. So photography, film before there was film grammar. What did people do when they didn't have film grammar yet? Before we knew that a cut-in shot was how you showed me what you were looking at, right? Like, before that happened, that was just some experiment somebody did. Somebody did that the first time, and they had to experiment, and it was weird. I think actually the first time that happened was in Chien de Leu, I think, with Louis Brumwell. There's that scene where he looks at the hand and there's the ants on it, and then he looks down at the street, and the camera cuts and sees the people around the body of the guy who jumped out of the window. And I think that's the first time on film where somebody looked at something and then they showed what the person was looking at. And that became a thing we do now. You just teach to people, like, oh, that's how you do it. Have people around you trust to tell you when you're being thick. Super important. I try to surround myself with people who aren't afraid to tell me that, like, hey, dude, I think you're a little attached to that precious baby of yours. You got to let it go. Go forward with optimism and intent, but be ready to let it go. Practice radical candor. I just find that the more honest we are, the better data we have. It's just like, if you lie to a model. I actually heard an Anthropic designer say this one time. It was great. She said, I make it a practice to never lie to a model. I don't think I'd even use that word lie previous to that. When I was working with a model, I wouldn't think of it as lying to the model. I would just say, like, that's why I prompted it. But to her, that's a lie. I misrepresented information. So one of the examples she had is that you have 20 minutes, right? You have I'm a teacher, and I want to do something, and I tell the AI as a model, you're a student who blah, but it's not a student. So what happens is, and what they've discovered is, when you prompt a model like that, because they have so much data available, they actually import lots of things about being a student that might not be relevant to the problem you're giving it. So instead, tell it, you're acting as a child in this context. And so the prompt context or the prompt engineering is one thing, but the context engineering is another. And that's very important. And then when thinking about synthetic intelligence, just, basically, anything you think about another form of intelligence, try it out on ourselves. Like, if it applies to that, does it apply to us? Just try it on. May not be accurate, but trying it on might give us a little more insight into how to approach these things as designers. And then the last thing is, don't expect lists like this to survive the real world. Because when you get out there and you start doing it, these things are all going to fall apart, and you're just going to have to make up something else. Because that's what it is to be in these spaces. That's all I got. If anybody has any questions?